What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Who Wants to Brawl YouTube channel. That is not a question, that is a statement. My name is Who, and I'm letting you know I want to brawl. Here, we're all about the Magic format Brawl, specifically in regards to Magic Arena, so we don't have to worry about budget, we only have to worry about wildcards. Today, we're going to be talking about Grakmaw, Skyclave Ravager. It is 3 mana for a 0/0, and it enters the battlefield with 3 +1/+1 counters. Whenever another creature we control dies, if it had a +1/+1 counter on it, we put a +1/+1 counter on Grakmaw. Then when Grakmaw dies, we create an XX black and green Hydra token, where X is the number of +1/+1 counters on Grakmaw. So with this deck, we're going to play around with a lot of +1/+1 counters. We're also going to have ways of sacrificing our creatures to make sure our creatures die to put a +1/+1 counter on Grakmaw, and to make sure Grakmaw dies to get that extra token into play. Our first strategy is going to be playing with +1/+1 counters. Grakmaw leaves behind a larger creature the more +1/+1 counters he has, so a lot of +1/+1 counter synergy will go a long way to making the deck run a little bit more efficiently. First up, we have Gnarlid Colony. It is a classic bear, but for an extra 3 mana we can kick it, and if we do kick it, it enters the battlefield with 2 additional +1/+1 counters. But additionally, arguably more importantly, it gives each of our creatures with a +1/+1 counter trample. The goal of this deck is to make our creatures large, specifically Grakmaw, through +1/+1 counters, and giving them a little bit of trample will go a long way to putting a lot of pressure on our opponents. Knight, which for a generic black and black enters the battlefield with 4 +1/+1 counters on it, and it must attack each combat if able. However, if damage would be dealt to it, instead prevent that damage and remove a 1/1 counter instead. Then we have Yorvo, Lord of Garenbrig, which for green, green, green also enters the battlefield with 4 +1/+1 counters on it. However, whenever another green creature enters the battlefield, such as Grakmaw, we get to put an additional +1/+1 counter on it. And then this part doesn't come up too often, but if the creature that enters the battlefield has a greater power than Yorvo, we put in another +1/+1 counter on it. Doesn't come up very often in this deck. And then we have Wildborn Preserver, which for 2 mana is a 2/2 with Flash and Reach, and whenever another non-human creature enters the battlefield under our control, which most of our creatures are, we may pay X. If we do, put X +1/+1 counters on Wildborn Preserver. And then we have Scavenging Ooze, which for 2 mana is a 2/2 ooze, and for a green, we can exile target card from a graveyard. If it was a creature card, put a +1/+1 counter on Scavenging Ooze, and we gain 1 life. A card that is very efficient at scrubbing graveyards. And then we have Wildwood Scourge, which for a green and X, it enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. Then, whenever 1 or more +1/+1 counters are put on another non-Hydra creature we control, we put a +1/+1 counter on Wildwood Scourge. Unfortunately, that means Grakmaw does not put a +1/+1 counter on it because it is a Hydra. However, most of our other creatures will put a +1/+1 counter on it. And then we have Stonecoil Serpent, which for X is a 0/0 reach, trample, protection from multicolored, and it enters the battlefield with X +1/+1 counters on it. And then we have Renata, Call to the Hunt. It's 4 mana for a star 3. Its power is equal to our devotion to green, so it enters the battlefield as a 2/3 on its own. And then each other creature enters the battlefield with an additional +1/+1 counter on it. And then playing with more +1/+1 counters, we have the Great Henge, which for 7 on green and green is a legendary artifact. The spell costs X less to cast, however, where X is the greatest power among creatures we control. The goal of this deck is to give Grakmaw as many +1/+1 counters as we can, so therefore this will get cheaper the more we just do what the deck wants to do. Then it taps to add green green, and we gain 2 life. And then, whenever a creature enters the battlefield under our control, it gets a +1/+1 counter on it, and we draw a card. Overall, a great engine for the deck. And then we have the Ozolith, which is a 1 mana legendary artifact. Whenever a creature we control leaves the battlefield, if it had counters on it, put those counters on the Ozolith. At the beginning of combat on our turn, If the Ozolith has counters on it, you may move all the counters from the Ozolith onto target creature. And then we have Hagra Constrictor, which for 3 mana enters the battlefield with 2+1/+1 counters on it and gives each one of our creatures with a +1/+1 counter on it menace. And then we have Skyclave Shadowcat, which is a 4 mana 3/3, and for 2 mana we can sack another creature and put a +1/+1 counter on Skyclave Shadowcat. Then, whenever a creature we control with a +1/+1 counter on it dies, draw a card. Again, another great engine for the deck. Next, we have a card that is in contention for one of the best cards in the deck, Invigorating Surge, which is a 3 mana instant that we put a +1/+1 counter on target creature we control, then double the number of +1/+1 counters on that creature. This card alone makes Grakmaw an 8/8, leaving behind an 8/8, at which point it's nearly impossible to deal with. And then we have the first Iroan Games, which is a 3 mana enchantment saga. At the first chapter, we create a 1/1 white soldier. On the second chapter, we put 3 +1/+1 counters on target creature we control. On the third chapter, if we control a creature with power 4 or greater, we draw 2 cards. And then on the fourth chapter, we create a gold token. Most of the time, we're going to want to put those counters on Grakmaw. That way, if they remove Grakmaw, we still will probably have a creature with power 4 or greater because of the token it leaves behind. And then for our final card that plays with counters, we have Vastwood Fortification, which is a 1 mana instant that we put a +1/+1 counter on target creature. However, this card makes the deck primarily because it can also double as a land. Most of the time we will play it as a land, however, it is nice to put that counter on Grakmaw when we need to. Our next strategy is Aristocrat style strategy. We have a lot of death triggers on our creatures, and we don't want to always rely on combat in order to trigger those. So we have a few cards in here that allow us to sack our creatures in order to gain some value. Specifically Grakmaw, so we can get that token. Our first Aristocrat style card is Rankle, Master of Pranks, which is a 4 mana 3/3 flying haste, and that when it deals combat damage to a player, we choose any number. Each player discards a card, or each player draws a card and loses 1 life, or each player sacrifices a creature. With this card, we'll almost always want to choose sacrifice a creature, specifically so we can sacrifice Grakmaw. Our next Aristocrat style card is Village Rites, which is a 1 mana instant. As an additional cost to cast it, we sacrifice a creature and then draw 2 cards. And then we have Woe Strider, which is 3 mana for a 3/2. When it enters the battlefield, we create an 0/1 white goat, and then we can sacrifice a creature to scry 1. It can also escape from the graveyard for 5 mana later in the game, always a nice benefit. It also comes with the additional upside that when it escapes with 2 +1/+1 counters on it, adding a little bit more synergy to the deck. And then our final Aristocrat style card is Witch's Cauldron, which is a 1 mana artifact, and for 2 mana, tap it, sack it, and then for 2 mana, tap it, sack a creature, we gain 1 life and draw a card. All of these cards give us additional value more than just the token Grakmaw creates when we sacrifice a creature, specifically Grakmaw. Our next topic is removal. As with any Brawl deck, we have to be able to remove the threats that our opponents put out if we want to win. With that being said, our first removal spell is Murderous Rider, which as a creature is 3 mana for a 2/3 lifelink that when it dies, we put it on bottom of our library. However, it has an adventure, which is 1, a black and a black for an instant that we can destroy a creature or planeswalker and lose 2 life. And then we have Heartless Act, which is a black and a colorless instant that we can choose one. Destroy target creature with no counters on it, or remove up to 3 counters from target creature. And then we have what I think should be a Brawl staple, Wilt. It is a colorless and a green to destroy target artifact or enchantment. However, we can cycle it away for 2 colorless mana. And then we have Thrashing Brontodon, which as an efficient creature is a 3 mana 3/4 that for 1 mana we can sacrifice it to destroy target artifact or enchantment. Artifact enchantment removal is very underrated in Brawl. We also have Eliminate, which is a 2-mana instant to destroy target creature or planeswalker with converted mana cost 3 or less. Then we have Hunter's Edge, which is 4 mana for a sorcery. We can put a +1/+1 counter on a creature we control, then that creature deals damage equal to its power to target creature we don't control. On top of being a removal spell, this is a nice way to get an additional +1/+1 counter on Grakmaw. And then we have Eat to Extinction, which is a 3 colorless and a black instant. We can exile target creature or planeswalker, and then look at the top card of our library and we may put that card into our graveyard. Sometimes it's a creature we might want to reanimate, so there is some upside to that. And then our final removal spell is Elspeth's Nightmare, which is 2 colorless and a black for an enchantment saga. On Chapter 1, we destroy target creature an opponent controls with power 2 or less. On Chapter 2, target opponent reveals their hand. We choose a non-creature, non-land card from it, and that player discards that card. And then on Chapter 3, we can exile target opponent's graveyard. This card is a built-in 2-for-1 that always overperforms. Next up, we have some Recursion. The primary function of this deck is not to recur creatures, so we want to be careful not to have too much. However, we are sacrificing our creatures, so a little bit of Recursion can go a long way in the right situation. First up, we have Call of the Death Dweller, which for 2 colorless and a black is a sorcery. We can return up to 2 target creature cards with total converted mana cost 3 or less from our graveyard to the battlefield. We put a Death Touch counter on either of them, then put a Menace counter on either one of them. If we reanimate Grakmaw, this means it gets a Death Touch and a Menace counter on it. Then we have Null Priest of Oblivion, which is a black and a colorless 2/1 Menace lifelink. However, it has Kicker for 3 colorless and a black. And when it enters the battlefield, if it was kicked, we can return a creature from our graveyard to play. And then we have Malakir Rebirth, which is a 1-mana instant. We can choose target creature. We lose 2 life, and until end of turn, that creature gains. When this creature dies, return it to the battlefield tapped under its owner's control. And then finally, we have Agadim's Awakening, which is X black for a sorcery. Return from our graveyard to the battlefield any number of target creatures that each have a different converted mana cost X or less. Malakir Rebirth and Agadim's Awakening can also double as lands if we need them in the early game. And finally, we have some utility pieces. Every deck needs some pieces that just help the deck function, and Grakmaw is no different. First up, we have Questing Beast, which is 4 mana for a 4/4, Vigilance, Death Touch, Lifelink. 4 mana for a 4/4, Vigilance, Death Touch, Haste. It can't be blocked by creatures with power 2 or less. Combat damage that would be dealt to creatures I control can't be prevented. And when it deals combat damage to an opponent, it deals that much damage to a planeswalker. One of the most efficient creatures ever printed, in my opinion. Then we have Polo-Kranos, Unchained, which is 4 mana for a 0/0 zombie Hydra. That when it enters the battlefield, it enters with 6 +1/+1 counters on it. If damage would be dealt to it while it has +1/+1 counters on it, prevent that damage and remove that many 1/1 counters instead. And then for 3 mana, Polo-Kranos can fight a creature. So this doubles as a creature and a removal spell. And then later in the game, for 6 mana and exiling 6 other cards from our graveyard, we can recur it, and it escapes with an additional 6 +1/+1 counters. I don't like that way that sounded. And then when it escapes with 12 +1/+1 counters. And then we have Fertilid, which is a 3 mana 0/0 that when it enters the battlefield, it enters with 2 +1/+1 counters, keeping with the synergy. And then for 2 mana, we can remove a +1/+1 counter on it to search our library for a basic land card and put it onto the battlefield tapped. And then we have Skyclave Shade, which for 2 mana is a 3/1 that can't block. However, it has a 3 mana kicker, and if it was kicked, it enters the battlefield with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. However, the most important part of this card is the landfall trigger that allows us to cast it from our graveyard. In a deck that wants to sacrifice things, this is a perfect early creature to put on the battlefield. And then we have Gilded Goose and Tangled Florahedron as a little bit of ramp cards in the early game. With Tangled Florahedron having the additional upside of coming down as a land when we need it to. And then finally we have Nissa of Shadowed Boughs, which for 2, a black and a green, is a 4 loyalty planeswalker that has landfall that whenever a land enters the battlefield, we can put a loyalty counter on her. For +1, we can untap target land we control, and then we may have it become a 3/3 elemental creature with haste and menace until end of turn, and it is still a land. And then, for -5, we may put a creature with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of lands we control onto the battlefield from our hand or graveyard with 2 +1/+1 counters on it. This card's ultimate is very easy to get to with its landfall trigger, and the flexibility of putting a card from our hand or the graveyard onto the battlefield and giving it an additional 2 +1/+1 counters makes this card a perfect fit for our deck. And finally, we're going to round the deck out with some land. Jungle Hollow and Temple of Malady each enter the battlefield tap and tap for a black or green. While the former enters the battlefield and gains its life, the latter enters the battlefield and can scry 1. Then Fable Passage taps and sacks to search our library for a basic land card, put it onto the battlefield, then if we control 4 or more lands, untap that land. And then Evolving Wilds does the same except keeps the land tapped. Then we have Castle Lochthwain, which enters the battlefield tapped unless we control a swamp and taps for a black. And then later in the game, for 3 mana untapping it, we can draw a card and lose life equal to the number of cards in our hand. And Command Tower taps to add 1 mana of any color in our commander's color identity. We also have Castle Garenbrig, which enters the battlefield tapped unless we control a forest, taps to add a green, and then for 4 mana and tapping it, we can add 6 green mana to our mana pool that we can only cast on creatures. And then we finish the deck with 8 swamps and 7 forests. And that's this week's video. If you like this video, be sure to like and subscribe. Share it with a friend to help the channel grow. Hit that bell icon to get notifications about new videos so you don't miss anything. I also want to give a shout out to my buddy Rob Slota for making the Who Wants to Brawl logo. He's a tattoo artist, and you can check out his work on Instagram using the link below. You can also email me at whowantstobrawl@gmail.com for any deck tech ideas. You can follow me on Twitter at whowantstobrawl. Also, check me out on Twitch. I stream last week's deck tech at 11 on Sundays. I also stream random Magic things on Mondays at 8 o'clock, and I try to get another stream in randomly throughout the week, sometimes Magic, sometimes not. Be sure to check out Twitter for when I pop up. But for now, this is Who, and I'm letting you know I'm done brawling for now. We'll see you later.